The clock was still 6 in the morning when Elizabeth entered the side door of the Whitmore mansion. The cold autumn air cut through his skin, but what weighed most was the immense silence that dominated that house of marble and stained glass. The smell of expensive coffee came from the kitchen, mixed with the strong aroma of the cleaning products she herself carried in the bucket. In a simple uniform, with her hair tied up anyway, she seemed invisible to the luxury around her. But behind the calloused hands that scrubbed the floor, there was a courage that no one imagined. As he dusted the oak furniture, his mind flew to Brazil. The image of her sick mother in a simple bed haunted her, along with the fear of not getting money for the surgery. She sighed deeply, cleaning every corner as if hope could be born from the glow she left behind. How many women have experienced the same? Pain kept in silence, tears hidden behind a humble smile. Upstairs, a door opened slowly. A slight boy piled blocks in absolute silence. The millionaire's son, silent for a year, and unknowingly, that ordinary cleaning lady was about to do the impossible, give voice back to a heart that the world believed lost. But before we dive into the heart of this story, I need you to know one thing. There was a moment when the world stopped inside that silent mansion. Daniel Whitmore, accustomed to ruling empires and controlling destinies, stood motionless in the door of his son's room when he witnessed the impossible. Andrew, silent since the tragedy that stole his mother, smiled and mumbled words for the first time in a year. On the carpet next to him was only a simple woman, kneeling with improvised puppets on her fingers and discreet tears in her eyes. No doctor, no specialist, no one has achieved this in 8 months. But a cleaning lady managed to do it in a few minutes. And it was at that moment that something inside that millionaire man broke forever. If this story has already touched your heart, I ask you to leave a like and subscribe, not as a mechanical gesture, but as a way to be with this woman who carried invisible pain and still transformed a life. Each support here is like a silent embrace. In all the Elizabeths of the world, women who clean up what no one sees, and who, however, have within them the strength capable of changing entire destinies. Elizabeth stepped down from the platform at Stamford Station still, with her shabby coat closed to her neck. The cold wind blew from the river, bringing a smell of sea air mixed with the gasoline of the cars that hurried by. She adjusted the strap of her faded bag on her shoulder and walked through the tree-lined streets toward the city's wealthiest neighborhood. Each step brought her closer to a world that was not her own, where iron gates and security cameras guarded mansions with tall windows and impeccable gardens. When he stopped before the Whitmore family gate, he took a deep breath. He knew that inside life was made of luxury, but also of pain that not even money could erase. The housekeeper Nancy opened the door with a stern look, without even a smile. She was a middle-aged woman, with an upright posture, her face marked by lines of distrust. "Are you the new cleaning lady?" he asked dryly. Elizabeth nodded, saying little, as someone who has already learned that in rich people's houses, humility can be confused with obedience. He entered with short steps, observing every detail of the mansion. The marble floor so polished that it reflected like a mirror, the oil paintings on the walls depicting serious ancestors, the almost suffocating silence that reigned in each room. With each movement, Elizabeth felt even smaller in the face of that grandeur. As he climbed the beige carpeted stairs, he noticed something that cut his heart. There were no recent family photographs on the walls, not a smiling image of little Andrew, nor memories of the tragically departed mother, just old and cold portraits, as if they wanted to erase any sign of everyday life. In the children's ward, she entered with the bucket of cleaning products. The citrus smell spread through the air, contrasting with the sweet artificial aroma of the expensive diffuser. The room was huge, full of expensive toys, scattered almost meticulously. Remote control cars lined up, teddy bears without hug marks, hardcover books that have never been flipped through. Everything seemed perfect but empty. That's when she saw him for the first time. Andrew sat on the floor, hunched over blocks of wood that he stacked in silence. He was a thin boy, with big and sad eyes, his face marked by the absence of words. Elizabeth stopped instinctively. He didn't know if he should talk, if he should get closer, but he realized something. No one there seemed to be looking at that real child. They only saw him as a fragile heir, as a patient in treatment, as a burden to be solved. She continued to clean the windows, but her eyes always came back to the boy. Andrew didn't raise his head. He didn't recognize her as a presence. Elizabeth swallowed, feeling that silence weighed more than any dirt she could rub away. It was at that moment that she reached into the pocket of her apron and found something stored, a small, crumpled photo of her mother in Brazil. He stared at his tired face and smiled slightly, as if he found strength in distant memories. Elizabeth was in the habit of carrying this portrait every day. It was her way of not forgetting where she came from and who needed her. Before resuming cleaning, he took from the notebook hidden inside his bag a folded sheet of paper on which he had written in simple handwriting, "Life is hard, but God is greater than everything." These phrases were like small bricks, building a fortress within her to withstand every silent humiliation. As he wiped the furniture, Andrew let go of a block that rolled to her feet. Elizabeth bent down slowly, picked up the piece, and held it for a moment. His fingers trembled slightly. He returned it to the boy with a shy smile. Andrew looked at her for less than a second, but said nothing. Still, that minimal contact felt like lightning passing through the darkness of the house. Deep down, Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. How many times in life has a child not only needed to be seen, just to be heard? How many humble women have witnessed the silence of a rich home and discovered that behind luxury there is loneliness? She took a deep breath, and a truth crossed her. Poverty was not only hers. Inside, there was also a deep poverty, that of affection, that of human warmth, that of presence. And in this moment of reflection, she remembered how much she carried silent pain that so many other women also know. Being invisible, swallowing your own words, working until your body hurts and still having to smile so you don't lose your job. If you who are listening have experienced something like this, if at any time in your life you also felt invisible, leave your comment. Write, "I've lived it," or "It's true," so that this silent pain never goes unnoticed. Elizabeth finished cleaning the children's ward in silence, but her gaze remained fixed on this boy who didn't even dare to look up. Something about her said that this would not be just any meeting. As he collected his materials and closed the door, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in that house that wasn't right, and as she walked down the stairs with light steps, Elizabeth had no idea that her every little gesture was being watched. Someone on the other side of the security cameras began to notice the human gaze she dedicated to Andrew. But who was this person? And how far would she be willing to allow a simple cleaning lady to cross the borders of a world that did not belong to her? Elizabeth was alone in the playroom, kneeling before a high shelf as she wiped the cloth with patient movements. The atmosphere was impeccable, but soulless. Expensive, untouched dolls, cars lined up like plastic soldiers, and a colorful carpet that looked more like a magazine set than a child's space. The silence was so heavy that you could hear the distant ticking of a wall clock. It was in this void that she noticed Andrew, sitting in the corner, stacking blocks with almost obsessive precision. The boy seemed to be in another world, with his lips closed and his gaze fixed on the wood, as if each piece were a wall between him and the rest of his life. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat faster. He could just finish his work and get out of there as everyone else did, pretending that he did not see the mute air. But something inside her refused to accept that silence. With slow steps, she approached, without interrupting what he was doing, just bending down to be at the same height. "Hi, Andrew," he said softly, his voice like the whisper of someone who is afraid of scaring a bird. The boy stopped for a moment, but did not raise his head. Elizabeth smiled, and without waiting for an answer, reached into the pocket of her apron. There, hidden as small treasures, were colorful fingers that she had brought from Brazil. He used them to play with his nephews on afternoons when poverty was pressing, when toys were few and his imagination needed to fill the void. He chose the yellow duckling, already a little worn, but with the same grace as always, and put it on his finger. He approached the boy and, in a funny voice, introduced the character. "Hi, Andrew, I'm the yellow duckling. I've come to befriend you." The boy looked up in surprise, as if he didn't believe anyone was addressing him like that. For the first time in a long time, someone treated him as a child, not as a patient in treatment. Elizabeth continued, inventing simple dialogues, moving her hands lightly, creating a small improvised show. She didn't expect him to respond. "I just wanted him to feel that he wasn't alone." The boy watched with increasing attention, his curious eyes following the doll's every move. Elizabeth then held out her hand, offering him the finger. "Want to try?" Andrew hesitated, his breath short, his fingers trembling a little before touching the plush. He picked up the little doll slowly and shook it awkwardly. Elizabeth laughed softly, not to mock, but to share that precious moment. The boy opened a shy smile, almost imperceptible, but enough to fill the room with a light that did not come from the windows. This was the first time in months that someone had torn something so simple, so human from him. Elizabeth felt the tears rise to her eyes, but she restrained herself. She knew she couldn't scare him with her emotion. He just continued to play, as if that moment was natural, as if smiling was something that had always been there. Time seemed suspended. She forgot about the cleaning bucket, the damp cloth slipped next to it, the heavy routine that awaited her. He even forgot about the overdue bills and the illness of his distant mother. At that moment, there was only her, a rag doll and a child, rediscovering the smile. The unexpected sound of a short, fragile laugh escaped Andrew's lips. It was like music, a breath of life in a house marked by mourning. Elizabeth felt her chest open in hope. That boy was not lost. It was enough for someone to see beyond the silence. Her heart murmured a simple truth. No child should be left alone in their own pain. Little did she know that they were not alone. In the monitoring room, a screen showed every corner of the mansion. Someone watched live that unlikely scene. The cleaning lady kneeling, smiling as if it were part of the boy's life, and the millionaire heir, for the first time, responding with joy. The watchful eyes of those who saw through the camera widened, and their breath was bated in the face of the improbable. The impossible had just happened. But what would they do with this discovery? And how would the powerful father react when he saw that the one who healed his son was not a renowned specialist, but a humble, invisible and invisible woman? It was off to a high start in Manhattan when Daniel Whitmore locked himself in his glass office on Park Avenue. From there, the entire city seemed to fit in the palm of his hand. Yellow taxis cruising the avenues, helicopters streaking the gray sky, men in suits hurrying like ants carrying their briefcases. To others, Daniel was the picture of success. CEO of a real estate empire, owner of buildings that touched the clouds and contracts that were worth more than small towns. But behind the mahogany table, in front of the impeccable glass, there was only one tired man. He looked at the computer screen full of numbers, but his mind insisted on wandering away. In the corner of the monitor, there was a hidden folder with home videos. With a hesitant click, Daniel opened those files and plunged into a past that corroded him. There was Sarah, his wife, smiling on a sunny afternoon in the garden, waving Andrew in her arms as the boy laughed loudly, his blonde hair swaying in the wind. Daniel appeared in some passages, laughing too, still without the shadow of guilt that now haunted him. With each recorded laugh, a greater weight fell on him, reminding him of the night of the accident when he insisted on driving despite the heavy rain. The memory was a ghost that visited him daily, and no one knew that he muttered softly to himself, "If only I had waited, if I had done it differently." On Sundays, this ghost would drag him to the cemetery, where expensive flowers could not hide the coldness of the white marble tombstone. He would stand, alone, without praying, without speaking. He only looked at his wife's engraved name as if he were waiting for a condemnation. Silence was his penance. To take care of Andrew, he had put all his trust in Karen Doyle, a renowned, sophisticated psychologist, always with technical words and impeccable reports. She said that the boy's recovery would be long, that any lay interference could jeopardize progress. Daniel believed. She didn't see herself as capable of giving her son what he needed. He was not a man of easy hugs, nor of affectionate phrases. He was a man of contracts, not feelings. He believed that science and method were the only way out of the abyss into which Andrew had fallen. But that morning, as he reviewed spreadsheets and million-dollar contracts, his cell phone vibrated discreetly on the table, a notification from the mansion security. Daniel unlocked the screen without expecting anything but banal reports. However, when pressing play, something inside him shook. The image was clear. The toy room, colorful carpet, scattered blocks. In the center, Andrew smiled. And next to him, kneeling, was the new cleaning lady, that woman in a simple uniform and with a serene look. On her fingers, a little rag doll danced, and the boy followed with lively eyes, laughing for real. Daniel widened his eyes. The video played again. Then once again. The scene seemed impossible. For 8 months, not a word, not a laugh, not a sign of joy. Doctors, psychologists, renowned specialists. No one has been able to break through the wall of silence. But there, in a few minutes, an invisible woman with a foreign accent and calloused hands had done the impossible. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his breathing heavy, his hands shaking slightly. What was happening in that house? Who was this woman who could get to where he and the professionals failed? The image of Andrew smiling burned inside him like an unexpected flame. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt that the world he controlled so tightly was about to slip through his fingers. But how far would he be willing to allow a simple cleaning lady to change his son's fate? And his too. The second day of work began like all the others, but for Elizabeth, each step down the icy corridor of the mansion seemed to carry a new responsibility. The housekeeper, strict as always, handed him the to-do list with an indifferent look, as if handing orders to someone who only serves to clean up what is left. Elizabeth just nodded, putting the paper in her apron pocket, and walked silently towards the playroom. The house was still immersed in that silence that weighed more than the marble walls. As he slowly opened the door, he found Andrew sitting on the carpet, surrounded by blank sheets of paper and a few scattered crayons. The boy, so small and fragile, drew solitary scribbles, without raising his eyes to anyone. Elizabeth hesitated for a second, but the memory of the shy smile of the previous day warmed her heart. She knelt down next to him, and without asking permission, pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "Can I draw too?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect an answer. With calm movements, he began to trace on paper a simple house, a tree, and in the center, a blonde child with the name Andrew, written in round letters. Next to it, he drew a star shining in the sky. Andrew stopped coloring for a few seconds, observing her features. Her blue eyes looked bigger, curious. Then he pointed with his fragile finger at the star. Her lips moved slowly, as if it were a secret kept deep in her soul. "Mommy?" Elizabeth swallowed, feeling the tears sting her eyes. She held his little hand gently and replied in a choked voice, "Yes, Andrew. His mom became a star. She watches over you every night." The boy stared at the drawing again, his eyes teary, but not in pain. There was tenderness there. It was as if a crack had opened in that wall of silence. He muttered the word again, firmer, "Mommy." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath so as not to collapse before him. Within her, a chain of memories came to light. Her own simple childhood, her mother who was now sick in Brazil, the faith that had always sustained her. And it was at that moment that she realized the weight she carried, invisible to the world. She followed in silence, holding pains that no one saw. And if you who follow this story now felt this weight, leave a like and subscribe. It's like holding Elizabeth's hand. showing that her struggle doesn't go unnoticed. Andrew pulled back the pencil and added a red heart next to the star. The simple gesture made Elizabeth smile in a way that mixed pain and hope. At that moment, the cold room seemed to be illuminated by something greater than any wealth in that house. In the hallway, someone was taking a deep breath. Daniel was standing in front of the half-open door, unable to believe what he had heard. His son had spoken. His hands trembled, his heart pounded, as if he wanted to escape his chest. He remained motionless, watching unseen, trying to decipher how this woman, with a worn apron and a thick accent, had achieved what months of professional sessions had not achieved. Elizabeth stood up slowly, picking up the sheets and arranging the pencils. She lightly touched the boy's head and whispered, "Your star mommy must be very proud of you." Andrew smiled almost imperceptibly, but it was a real smile. Upon leaving the room, Elizabeth was surprised by Daniel's imposing presence in the hallway. He stared at her with a mixture of incredulity and something she couldn't define. "Who taught you to do that to him?" she asked in a low, almost hoarse voice. Elizabeth took a deep breath, not escaping his gaze. "No one," he replied firmly. "It was just my heart." Daniel remained silent, caught between the arrogance he had always worn as armor and the recognition that something extraordinary had just happened before his eyes. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know how to react, but one thing was clear. Nothing in that mansion would be the same after that moment, and perhaps from then on, the buried secrets would begin to stir like embers under the ash, ready to set everything on fire. The muffled roar of an imported engine heralded the arrival of Dr. Karen Doyle at the Whitmore mansion. The clock had already passed the appointed time, but the therapist walked with firm steps, high heels echoing in the marble of the hall, as if the delay was just another proof of how indispensable her presence was. Elegant in a grey suit, blonde hair impeccably tied, she carried on her face the expression of someone who was used to being heard and respected without question. Daniel greeted her with a cold look. He didn't like delays, and even less the feeling that he was paying fortunes to someone who treated his time as disposable. But he contained his irritation, because he believed that this woman represented the hope of a cure for his son. Karen was ushered into the playroom, but when she walked across the corridor, she found only Andrew sitting on the carpet, scribbling silently. Elizabeth had just left, her heart still heavy for the words she had heard from the boy. Karen straightened her posture, observed the boy with a clinical air, and mentally wrote down each gesture. Minutes later, Daniel entered the room. There was a different sparkle in her eyes, a restlessness that Karen soon noticed. "Has something happened?" she asked, squeezing the leather briefcase into her lap. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands still trembling from what he had witnessed minutes before. "He spoke," he said dryly. Karen raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Did you speak? What exactly?" Daniel hesitated. "I said, 'Mommy,' while drawing with the cleaning lady." The heavy air that settled in the room was almost palpable. Karen maintained her posture, but her jaw hardened. "The cleaning lady?" he repeated, with a carefully masked tone of incredulity. "Daniel, you need to understand that lay interventions can confuse the child. Andrew needs method, technical support. If anyone decides to play therapist, the process can go backwards." Daniel stared at her, uncomfortable. Inside him, the memory of Andrew smiling next to Elizabeth seemed to contradict her every word. Karen, noticing the hesitation, crossed her legs elegantly and continued, "I know you're vulnerable, that any progress feels like a miracle, but we need to be rational. A woman with a high school education and an apron cannot replace years of clinical training." The sentence cut through the air like a blade. Daniel did not answer. He was silent, but inside him something moved. She remembered Elizabeth's sweet voice, the way her son reacted to her in such a short time, and she couldn't help but compare it to the doctor's 8 months of coldness and diagnosis. Karen perceived his silence as a threat. He smiled forcefully, trying to regain ground. "I don't say this for myself, but for Andrew's sake. Traumatized children quickly become attached to inappropriate figures. We need to protect him from that. Daniel lowered his eyes, unable to assume out loud that perhaps this simple woman had touched her son's heart in a way that no science could. And while Karen arranged the papers in the folder with nervous movements, Elizabeth, on the other side of the house, folded cleaning cloths, without imagining that the seed of conflict had just been planted. A silent battle began to break out within those luxurious corridors, and soon the struggle between reason and heart would spare no one. But how far would Daniel be willing to defy the prejudice of his own class to defend the woman his son had already begun to love in silence? The following days brought a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but which carried the weight of a miracle. Andrew, who had once looked like a ghost wandering around his own house, now dragged sheets of paper across the floor of the playroom, coloring with childlike enthusiasm. Elizabeth sat next to him, her apron still smelling of soap and disinfectant, but with a light heart, as if she were part of that universe of colors. The boy pointed to her drawings, softly repeating loose words: friend, star, mum. It was as if he had found an invisible thread that pulled him back to life. Elizabeth listened patiently, responded with gestures, smiles, and little scribbles back, creating with him a secret language that no trained adult had dared to try to understand. Time ran differently when they were together. She forgot the cold of the early mornings on the way to the station. She forgot the cold eyes of the housekeeper, Nancy. She even forgot the rigidity that hung over that house. There was there, in the simplicity of a child's gaze, a new hope that flourished despite the icy marble of the walls. Sometimes Andrew drew a star bigger than all the others, and Elizabeth understood what didn't need to be said. His mother was still alive within every innocent feature. However, while Andrew flourished, Elizabeth's life on the other side of the ocean threatened to fall apart. On a cold night, she ran to the mansion's laundry room to answer an international call. Her sister's voice sounded trembling from Brazil. Her mother's health had deteriorated, and doctors spoke of urgent surgery. The cost was far beyond what Elizabeth could save with her salary as a cleaner. The cell phone almost fell out of his hands when he heard the amount. The ground seemed to disappear under his feet. Leaning against the wall between baskets of clean clothes, she let the tears fall, muffling her sobs so as not to attract attention. The pain of the distance was cruel, and at that moment the mansion looked more like a prison than a job. The low cry echoed in the narrow space when a light noise interrupted the wail. Andrew was standing in the doorway, his blue eyes fixed on her. Elizabeth tried to wipe her face in a hurry, but it was too late. The boy approached slowly, raised his small hands, and in shy English muttered, "Don't cry." Her heart broke and rebuilt itself in the same instant. She smiled through tears and hugged him tightly, as if in that gesture she found the courage she needed. For the first time, it was not she who healed Andrew's silence, but the boy who brought solace to his pain. And as she pressed him to her chest, he felt a silent certainty. Maybe they were both saving each other. From the hallway, Nancy watched the scene with narrow eyes. The housekeeper, always suspicious, saw in that proximity something out of the ordinary, something that, in her rigid vision of hierarchy, should not exist between mistress and maid, boss and employee. But Nancy did not know the invisible pains that united these two. What flourished among them was greater than prejudices and rules. And here I need to tell you an intimate truth. The most remarkable moment of this story is yet to come. What Elizabeth will live next will challenge everything: the secrets of the mansion, the arrogance of the powerful, and even the love she herself thought she didn't deserve. But before that, there remained the question that burned in his chest that night: how to save his mother's life without losing what he had just built with Andrew. Karen Doyle's phone rang non-stop that week. From her elegant Manhattan office, she articulated every word carefully, like conducting an orchestra of intrigue. "Daniel is vulnerable," he said in a low voice. "There is an employee approaching the boy in a way reckless. On the other end of the line, partners, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances listened to his version, and the news spread in exclusive circles like a slow poison. Within days, the halls of the Whitmore mansion, once just cold, became hostile to Elizabeth. Her colleagues on the cleaning team avoided talking. Some looked away, others whispered when she passed by. Nancy, the housekeeper, changed her schedule without explanation. Less time near the children's room, more time in the basements and laundry rooms. The message was clear. They wanted to take her away from Andrew. Elizabeth felt the invisible weight of this rejection. He worked in silence, but each step echoed as if he were an intruder in forbidden territory. Daniel, pressured by partners and his own family, began to act differently. If before he had looked at her with silent gratitude, now he barely met his eyes. Short, distant, bureaucratic words. Elizabeth kept everything silent, but every cold gesture was like a knife. For Andrew, the change was even more painful. The boy, who had already learned to smile next to her, now watched her from afar, confused. One grey morning, as she collected scattered toys, he approached, his blue eyes full of questions he didn't know how to formulate. With effort, he whispered, "Elizabeth, not friend anymore." Those 3 words pierced her heart like a storm. Elizabeth bent down, touched the boy's delicate face, and tried to smile, but her voice came out trembling. "Always your friend, Andrew, always." But inside she bled silently. And this is where I need to open a space for reflection. How many times has someone been removed from where they most wanted to be, not by mistake, but by prejudice and intrigues? If you've ever felt this pain, leave a comment, even if it's a simple "I understand," because it's in this exchange that we discover that we weren't alone. The boy hugged her tightly, as if to prevent the world from tearing her away. Elizabeth closed her eyes and for a moment wished that this embrace was enough to protect them from the looks and voices that judged them. But she knew the siege was closing, and the question throbbing in her mind was devastating. How far would they be willing to go to wrest her from Andrew's life? The main hall of the Whitmore mansion was lit by the glow of crystal chandeliers, reflecting off champagne glasses and the heavy jewelry of Greenwich's high society women. It was a charity brunch, one of those gatherings where luxury was disguised as charity, but everyone knew that the looks were more important than the amounts collected. Elizabeth had been assigned to help discreetly in the kitchen, preparing trays and checking starched linen towels. The simple uniform distinguished her from all the others, and she felt safe behind the doors of service, invisible as she had always been. But by mistake, one of the organizers asked her to take a tray of coffees to the main room herself. Elizabeth took a deep breath, adjusted her apron, and walked through the golden door. The buzz of the guests died down when she walked in. Women in expensive dresses, men in tailored suits, and in the center Karen Doyle, surrounded by admirers. One of the ladies lifted her chin, watching Elizabeth as if examining a curious object. "So this is the miracle babysitter," he commented loud enough for all to hear. Restrained laughter spread like sparks. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear, but felt her face burn. He followed the tray to the table, balancing his dignity in the same effort in which he balanced the cups. Karen stood up slowly, elegant as ever, and walked over. He stood beside her, so close that Elizabeth could smell the expensive, sickening perfume that surrounded her. The therapist tilted her face and murmured, in a calculatedly audible tone, "You may have charmed the boy, but don't confuse affection with qualification." The words fell like stones on the marble floor. Elizabeth felt the gazes pierce her body like blades. The silence that followed was even crueler than the laughter before. At that moment, Andrew appeared in the room, running through the corridors without noticing the charged environment. Seeing Elizabeth surrounded by hostile looks, he clung to her legs and hid behind her apron, cowering as if he wanted to protect her. Elizabeth held the tray tighter, trying to contain the tremor. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't abandon the boy. The scene was visible from afar, and Daniel was there, in the background, watching. Her eyes followed Andrew's gesture, the discomfort on the employee's face, Karen's poisonous words. But he remained motionless, without intervening, without offering a word in defense. Daniel's silence weighed more than any humiliation. Elizabeth took a deep breath, swallowing the tears that threatened to escape. She bowed slightly, handing over the tray as if nothing had happened. Andrew squeezed her hand tightly, not understanding the layers of cruelty hidden in this room. For the guests, it was just another low-key spectacle of power and hierarchy, but for Elizabeth, it was the hardest blow. In that instant, she felt that perhaps she had gone too far, that the audacity to approach Andrew and touch his pain was an unforgivable mistake in that world that did not accept humble hands shaping rich destinies. As he recalled his steps back to the kitchen, the feeling of abandonment was sharp. A question throbbed in his chest: how to continue fighting, if even those who could defend it preferred silence. The mansion's library was plunged into silence. Only the crackle of the fireplace filled the heavy air. Daniel waited, standing before the mahogany table, his gaze distant, as if rehearsing the words he needed to say. Elizabeth entered slowly, holding her apron with trembling hands. Her heart was pounding. She knew nothing good would come of that call. Daniel took a deep breath before speaking, his voice deep and restrained. "Elizabeth, I want to thank you for what you have done for Andrew. I know he reacted in ways that no one imagined, but under the guidance of Dr. Doyle and pressure from the family, we thought it best to relocate her to another wing of the house, far from his room." The next silence was deafening. Elizabeth felt the world collapse inside her, but kept her posture upright. "It's better this way for all of us," he added, not daring to look her in the eye. She just nodded, keeping her dignity as her only armor. When he left, he walked down the corridor as if crossing a desert. Andrew, on the other side of the house, soon noticed her absence. At dinner, he refused the food. During the night, the cry echoed through the corridors, sharp and cutting. Nancy said it was mourning, but Daniel knew it was nostalgia. The next day, Andrew didn't want to draw. He didn't want to play. He just held the pillow, murmuring softly between sobs. In one of the sessions, Karen coldly noted on her notebook, "These symptoms are to be expected. It's the broken attachment." But Daniel no longer believed. The son's gaze was not one of adaptation. It was one of pain. Every time he saw Andrew refuse food or turn his face to the sun, something inside him revolted. One night, as the boy lay down, he sat on the edge of the bed, watching his son curl up in silence. The room was dark. Only the soft light of the lamp illuminated the forgotten drawings on the table. Suddenly, Andrew opened his mouth and muttered the only word of the day, "Elizabeth." The sound echoed like thunder in Daniel's soul. It was a cry for help, clear as any scream. He closed his eyes, feeling the guilt burn in every fiber of his body. And if this piece of Elizabeth's life can be a mirror or a hug for someone, does it help me carry it forward? Like and subscribe here to the channel. It makes more difference than you think. Andrew fell asleep with tears on his face, and Daniel stood there, motionless, crushed between the reason they demanded of him and the heart that beat at his son's pain. That morning, the question that throbbed in his mind gave him no rest. How long would he be able to sustain the lie that removing Elizabeth was best for everyone? Mornings in New Rochelle were different from those in Greenwich. The rhythm was more human, less suffocated by the glitz of luxury, and more marked by the smell of cheap coffee on street corners and the sound of children running around in narrow streets. Elizabeth walked with brisk steps to the small community library, a place where she took refuge whenever she needed to think. The mansion's uniform had stayed at home, and in that simple coat, she looked like just another immigrant trying to blend into the scenery. But inside, he carried a restlessness that gave him no peace. I knew there was something wrong with Dr. Karen Doyle. The therapist's arrogance, the coldness with Andrew, the phrases that seemed more like judgments than guidelines. It all sounded false. Elizabeth had no proof, only intuition, but now she could no longer ignore it. She sat down in front of an old computer, carefully typing the name that seemed to weigh on her fingers. Karen Doyle. In the first results, only articles from magazines on elite psychology, expensive lectures in five-star hotels, columns in important newspapers. But as he went deeper, he found what he was looking for: records of archived cases, documents forgotten in the digital corners of justice. One of them caught his attention: complaint of removal of a minor, autistic patient. His father's name was there: Matthew L. Warner. Elizabeth bit her lips, feeling her heart race. On the side, a lost note on a legal blog explained the accusations made by the therapist were not proven. There was no risk to the child, but the separation had already destroyed an entire family. Elizabeth wrote down the name, each letter scribbled with the strength of someone holding a key. Then he researched until he found a possible contact. A woman, the boy's mother, still lived in Westchester County. The courage came like a breath. If Karen had done this before, she could be repeating the same strategy. He arranged a secret meeting with his mother in a modest coffee shop near the station. When he arrived, he found a tired woman, her eyes marked by years of struggle. The son, now a teenager, was waiting in the car. Her mother's hands trembled as she held the cup. "She ruined us," he said in a low voice. She said that, at first, Karen seemed dedicated, but soon began to sow distrust between her parents. He whispered that his father was too controlling, that his presence worsened the treatment. In the end, he convinced the justice system to remove him. Months later, the reports showed that there was no risk, but it was too late. The family bond had been destroyed. The woman took a deep breath, her eyes teary. She prolonged the treatment for years, because she needed our bank account. It wasn't about my son. It was about the money. Elizabeth listened to every word with a tight chest. I felt anger, but also compassion. He discreetly turned on the cell phone recorder, recording the report. He knew that that file was more than proof. It was a cry for justice stuck in time. When the woman finished, she took hold of Elizabeth's hand. "Be careful. She is intelligent. She knows how to manipulate. If you're messing with it, it's going to try to destroy you too." Elizabeth nodded, but did not back down. He put his cell phone in his pocket, his heart beating fast. Now he had what he needed, a buried truth that could turn everything upside down. And this is where I need to tell you something intimate. Stories like this remind us that behind every perfect facade, there may be a secret capable of breaking down walls. Hold on tight with me, because what is about to happen will prove that no one, not even the most powerful, can hide the truth forever. As she left the cafeteria, the cold wind hit her face, but Elizabeth felt warm inside. For the first time in weeks, he had hope. There was only one question left that haunted her on the way back. When Daniel discovers the truth about Karen, will it be too late to save Andrew? Elizabeth spent the night awake, the envelope resting on the small table in the rented room in Stamford. Inside it were copies of the notes, excerpts from the old lawsuits, and the recording of the testimony of Matthew's mother. It was little compared to Karen's power, but it was the truth, and the truth needed to be told. In the morning, she took the train to Manhattan, her heart racing at each station, approaching Park Avenue. In the glass-enclosed front desk of the Whitmore Company, the luxury made her look even smaller, but she raised her head with the dignity she carried as armor. She managed to be announced, and minutes later, she was in front of Daniel, in the office that dominated the city skyline. He looked at her with surprise and a certain coldness, as if he were still protected by invisible walls. Elizabeth did not tremble. He held out the envelope. "I didn't come to ask for a job. I came to protect Andrew." Daniel hesitated, accepted the package and opened it. With each document, his gaze became denser. Her hands slid over to the recording on her phone, and when she heard Matthew's mother's voice telling the story, her eyes hardened. Elizabeth said nothing more. He just stood up, bowed silently, and left. That night, alone in his penthouse, Daniel called the number written on the papers. Matthew's mother answered, and her every word confirmed what Elizabeth had told. Daniel walked through the apartment with heavy steps, as if the floor might crumble beneath his feet. He felt his confidence crumble, and with it the pride that had always made him choose silence. The next day, he arranged to meet Elizabeth in an unlikely place, Central Park, on a wooden bench facing the lake, reflecting the cloudy sky. Elizabeth arrived in the same shabby coat, her eyes tired but steady. Daniel watched her for a while in silence before speaking. "You were the only one who didn't ask for anything, and the only one who really listened to my son." His voice carried a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability that he rarely let slip. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, not knowing what to answer. The tension between them was more than professional. It was the collision of two opposing worlds, united by love for an injured child. Daniel took a deep breath, took courage and said, "I want you to come back, not as a cleaner, as a trusted caregiver. Andrew needs you." And deep down, so did I. The icy wind swayed the trees around, but Elizabeth felt a deep warmth in her chest. It was the beginning of a new alliance, but also the riskiest step of his life, because if she accepted, she would be entering a territory where the secrets of that family would not be hidden for long. And what would Karen do when she found out that she was about to lose the power she held so carefully? The Whitmore mansion was prepared for one of those gatherings that mixed business and family, as if the cold marble walls could hold so much power and so much silence at the same time. In the main room, partners, advisors, and close relatives occupied the leather sofas and classic armchairs, while Daniel stood in front of everyone, his gaze steady, his breathing controlled. Behind him, discreetly, Elizabeth stood next to the corridor, not knowing if she really should be there. The invitation had come from him, but the environment seemed to tell him otherwise. Expensive clothes, imported perfumes, suppressed laughter, looks that crossed her as if he were invisible. Daniel cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming. Today I want to present an important decision for the future of my family, and above all, for the well-being of my son." Some looked at each other, surprised by the solemn tone. Elizabeth felt her hands sweat inside her worn coat. Then, in front of everyone, Daniel stretched out his arm towards her. "This is Elizabeth. From today on, she will be responsible for Andrew's emotional support." A murmur ran through the room like cold wind. One of the partners frowned, an aunt raised her eyebrows in disapproval, and Nancy, the housekeeper, bit her lips so as not to show surprise. It was at that moment that the door opened with force. Karen Doyle entered, impeccable in a sober dress and understated jewelry, but her gaze burned with pent-up anger. "Is that a joke, Daniel?" The room plunged into silence. "You're really going to put your child's emotional health in the hands of a cleaning lady?" The word echoed like a sharp knife. Elizabeth lowered her head, feeling each letter weigh in. Daniel, however, did not waver. "Karen, you arrived at a good time. We were precisely talking about transparency." He opened a briefcase he kept on the table and, without changing his tone of voice, showed the documents that Elizabeth had given him. "These are records of past cases, complaints, shelved processes. Parents who lost custody of their children based on reports that later proved to be wrong." Karen blushed but tried to keep her composure. "This is defamation. It's persecution. These stories have been distorted. I'm respected by the scientific community, you know that. It's not going to destroy my career with cheap rumors." Daniel did not respond immediately. He just let the silence linger, heavy, uncomfortable, until small footsteps echoed in the hallway. Andrew emerged with disheveled hair and a firmer gaze than anyone had seen since his mother's death. He stared at the scene, noticed Karen, and cringed for a moment. But then she advanced to her father and, in front of everyone, said in a clear and decisive voice, "I don't want her. I want Elizabeth." The words, simple and pure, were like a hammer breaking a wall. The boy who had gone months without speaking, whom everyone thought was lost in his silence, had chosen aloud. The shock was immediate. Eyes turned to Elizabeth, some in reproach, others in disbelief, and even Nancy let out a sigh. Karen tried to get closer. "Andrew, honey, you're confused. It's normal to feel—" But the child clung to Elizabeth's arm, hiding his face against her. Elizabeth felt the boy's body tremble, and her instinct was just to wrap around him, to protect him, as she would a son. "Shh, it's okay. I'm here." The gesture spoke more than any document. The room, which used to look like a courtroom, has become a stage for revelation. Daniel closed the briefcase and faced Karen coldly. "You heard it. My son spoke, and it wasn't because you treated it as a diagnosis. It was because someone finally treated him like a child." Embarrassed, Karen still tried to regain control. "Daniel, you are making an irreversible mistake. It's going to tarnish your reputation, the business, everything you've built." But her voice no longer had any strength. Some associates looked away, others whispered, and one of the aunts, who had previously frowned, now watched Elizabeth with silent respect. Andrew raised his head and repeated louder this time, as if he wanted to be heard by the world. "Elizabeth." And he smiled. A simple smile, but so rare that it seemed to light up the entire room. Karen realized that she had lost. His eyes watered, but not of regret, but of fury. He picked up his bag with sudden movements and left the house without saying goodbye, leaving behind him a trail of expensive perfume mixed with the bitter feeling of defeat. The silence lasted a few seconds. Then something unexpected happened. One of the partners, a middle-aged man, began to clap his hands, shy at first, but soon joined by others. It was not a thunderous ovation, but enough to break the weight that hung over the room. Elizabeth, surprised, kept her humble posture. She hugged Andrew even tighter, and when their gazes turned to her, she said only, "I only listened to his heart." And it was at that moment that Daniel realized this simple woman in a worn uniform and teary eyes had done what no specialist, no fortune and no power had achieved. She had torn down the wall that kept her son a prisoner of silence. But if a wall had fallen, other secrets still remained, waiting for the right time to collapse. And the question no one dared to ask out loud was, who else would be willing to destroy this new hope to keep their masks intact? The following days brought a transformation that was almost imperceptible at first, but soon took over every corner of the Whitmore mansion. Elizabeth returned to Andrew's side, no longer just as the cleaning lady everyone ignored, but now with the recognition of someone who carried a mission within her heart. Daniel, faithful to the promise made before his family and partners, not only increased her salary, but also gave her dignity, treating her with the respect she had always deserved. Andrew, on the other hand, flourished visibly. The words that once came in whispers now turned into small sentences. The drawings that filled solitary sheets now made up colorful stories that he wanted to show to everyone. At Elizabeth's suggestion, a new therapist was hired, Dr. Michael Harris, a young, attentive one with an integrative approach that was not limited to diagnoses, but saw the child as a whole being. The contrast with Karen was stark. Michael sat on the floor, drew, laughed, took the boy's time, and never forced anything. Elizabeth watched him closely and felt relief, as if Andrew was finally in good hands. Daniel, previously absent, began to allow himself to be present. At breakfast, instead of just reading reports, he let Elizabeth and Andrew convince him to try pancakes with strawberries, a simple custom that became a ritual. In the afternoon, he would join the two in the garden, watching his son run with a makeshift kite or try to reproduce drawings he saw in books. At night, Elizabeth read stories to Andrew as he lay down, and Daniel, often standing in the doorway, realized how that sweet voice was able to drive away the nightmares that had haunted him since his mother's death. For the first time in months, Andrew slept peacefully, hugging the teddy bear that he almost didn't let go. The house, once dominated by silence and the cold smell of waxed furniture, began to come to life. The aroma of cookies baked by Elizabeth invaded the corridors. New photographs were placed on the walls, images of Andrew smiling, of simple moments, of small achievements. Even Nancy, the housekeeper, who at first viewed this approach with suspicion, began to admit in low conversations with the team that the mansion was different, less heavy, more alive. For Elizabeth, it was like living a dream in reverse. not the luxury of the mansion, which mattered little to her, but the chance to see a child believe in the world again. With each smile Andrew's, she remembered her own nephews in Brazil, and with each new word he uttered, she felt that her mother, even distant and sick, would be proud. Many nights, alone in the simple room given to her, she cried in silence, not of sadness, but of the mixture of gratitude and fear. Gratitude for living something so transformative, and fear that at any moment this happiness could be taken away from her. Daniel, in turn, lived an internal conflict that he hid from everyone. He saw Elizabeth as the force that had resurrected his son, as someone who carried a purity that money could not buy. But at the same time, he felt the invisible barrier that society placed between them. Partners, neighbors, relatives, they all talked about the employee who spent too much time with Andrew, and yet, when he allowed himself to look beyond those voices, he saw in Elizabeth something he hadn't felt since Sarah, the presence of someone who didn't expect anything in return. There was one night in particular when this contrast became even clearer. Elizabeth was in the kitchen, finishing the dishes, when Andrew appeared with a storybook in his hands. "Read," he asked. Elizabeth smiled and led him back to the bedroom, sitting down by the bed to read. Daniel, who was watching from the doorframe, saw his son close his eyes at the sound of her voice and fall asleep peacefully. The scene broke him inside. He approached slowly and said in a low voice, "You gave my son back to me." Elizabeth didn't answer right away, just adjusted the blanket over Andrew and muttered, "He just needed to be heard." This fragile balance began to redesign the Whitmore family's life. Business meetings, once Daniel's absolute priority, began to lose space to entire afternoons dedicated to playing with Andrew. Elizabeth became not only the caretaker, but an essential presence, capable of transforming a stone mansion into a living home. However, like any change that challenges power structures and prejudice, this new peace carried the shadow of something that had not yet fully revealed itself. Because, while the walls echoed laughter and stories outside, there were those who did not accept losing so easily, and the silent question that hung in the air was, how long would this happiness last before the next storm? The storm roared outside like an ancient warning, strong winds swayed the trees in the garden, and thunder echoed off the walls of the Whitmore mansion. Inside Andrew's room, darkness had set in after the power failed, but Daniel emerged carrying candles, illuminating the space with a warm, flickering light. Elizabeth was sitting on the carpet, surrounded by toys and colorful blocks, keeping the boy calm amid the frightening noise. As the flame danced in his father's hands, Andrew smiled shyly, as if that night had taken on an air of adventure. The three of them stayed together, inventing shadows on the wall, turning the fear of the storm into a game of courage. Andrew laughed softly when Elizabeth shadowed a rabbit, and Daniel clumsily created monsters that were soon defeated by the stories she made up off the cuff. For the first time, the entire mansion seemed to be alive only in that candle-lit room. When the time for sleep came, Andrew, in a sleepy voice, quietly asked, "Stay, both." He wanted them both there, close to him. Daniel and Elizabeth looked at each other. There was tenderness in the boy's eyes, and something deeper in the silence that was made between the adults. Without arguing, they lay down by the bedside, each on one side, holding the boy's hand until his eyes closed in peace. The room, bathed only in the soft light of the candles, was enveloped in a different, almost sacred silence. When they realized that Andrew was already asleep, Daniel remained motionless, but his eyes sought Elizabeth's. Her face, lit by the flickering flame, seemed more real than ever, simple, tired, but full of a beauty that came from the soul. He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage, and said in a low tone, "You've changed everything here, Elizabeth. Not only Andrew, the whole house, so did I." She looked away, clasped her hands on her lap, and replied humbly, "It wasn't me. He was the one who changed me. I only listened to what he couldn't say." There was a long silence, loaded with something that both avoided staring. Daniel took a slow step, approached until he held her hand, The touch was soft, but intense enough to make her shiver. Elizabeth raised her eyes and found his, which were teary. For a moment the world seemed to give way, as if a new beginning could be born there. Daniel tilted his face, his breath choking, almost asking permission. Elizabeth's heart raced, but before their lips met, she pulled back, letting go of his hand. Her voice came out low but firm. "You're a boss, and I'm just a woman who cleans houses." The words echoed like an invisible barrier between the two. Daniel was silent, wounded not by the rejection, but by the raw truth she had exposed. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, as if she wanted to protect herself not from him, but from the very feeling that was beginning to be born within her. She walked to the window, observed the storm outside, and felt the same turbulence inside her. There was desire, there was fear, there was the certainty that they did not belong to the same world. In the reflection of the glass, he saw his simple image contrasting with the elegant figure of him reflected in the background. This contrast was a cruel reminder of the distance that separated them. Elizabeth took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and let out an intimate thought. There are things that we live and keep, but maybe by telling, we will help another heart to breathe. Like this video and sign up, and let's make this story reach those who need it. It was like a whisper to the heart of those who accompanied her, a silent request for company so that her pain would not be invisible. Daniel, still standing in the center of the room, observed the silent strength of that woman. He did not insist. He knew that there was an abyss of prejudices, fears, and social rules between them, but he also knew that something greater was already connecting them. Elizabeth turned, met his gaze again, and at that moment they both understood that they could not extinguish what was already lit. All that remained was to decide if they would be strong enough to face the consequences. From the hallway, a louder thunder made the house tremble, and deep in the soul of each one, a question was formed, cutting and inevitable. How far would life allow this hidden feeling to be carried forward before someone destroyed it? The night in Greenwich had a golden glow, typical of houses that are filled with polite voices, crystal glasses, and rehearsed conversations. Daniel had made a decision that weighed like a stone in his chest, to publicly assume Elizabeth as an essential part of Andrew's life. Not just the employee, not just the invisible woman who walked silently around the mansion, but the official caretaker, someone to whom he entrusted what was most precious to him. The dinner, prepared for close friends and partners, seemed the perfect setting for this announcement. Elizabeth, in a simple dress and hair tied up with delicacy, helped discreetly until the moment Daniel called her to the table. The gesture was small but huge in meaning. He wanted her to sit between them. The guests looked at each other. Some smiled politely, others disguised their discomfort. Among the voices of the elite, there were always those who knew how to turn courtesy into poison. It was during dessert, while Andrew was showing a drawing he had made, that the silence was broken by a comment that cut like a blade. One of the lawyers, renowned, with a voice full of irony, blurted out, "How curious, Daniel. It's not every day that a cleaning lady climbs on a broom to an official caregiver." The words, spoken in a jocular tone, echoed through the room as if every syllable had been hurled at Elizabeth. She listened. He listened as if he were listening to a sentence. Her fingers tightened the napkin in her lap, but her face remained steady, as if to protect Andrew from that pain. However, the child, who had already learned to recognize the nuances of silence, noticed. Andrew stood up suddenly, his eyes sparking as never before. "She's not a maid," he shouted in English, his voice broken but clear. "She's my family." The impact was immediate. The entire table plunged into silence, a silence that no toast could break. The boy, once mute, previously trapped within himself, defended with the innocence of someone who knows what true love is. Daniel then stood up firmly and in a deep voice added, "Elizabeth is not only part of my son's life, she is part of my life, and it deserves respect." Uncomfortable looks ran among the guests. Some coughed, others looked away from the plates, but Elizabeth could no longer stay. He excused himself in a low voice, almost a whisper, and left the room. His footsteps echoed down the hallway to the bedroom, where he locked himself in. Inside, he sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time allowed the tears to flow without resistance. She looked at her own hands, calloused from so many years of cleaning, and murmured to herself, "I will never belong to this world." That sentence was not just an outburst, it was the weight of a lifetime marked by exclusion, by the feeling of always being the shadow, never the light. Outside, the conversations resumed amid embarrassment, but for Elizabeth nothing else mattered. There, in that room, her pain was that of all women who have ever been judged by the uniform they wore, by the simplicity of what they carried. And it is at this moment that we need to stop and breathe along with it, because maybe you have also felt this lump in your throat, this place of non-belonging. And if you've experienced this, comment below. I understand. I've been through this, because sometimes just by sharing, we discover that we are not alone. Later, without the guests, Daniel knocked on the door of her room. There was no arrogance in his voice, only vulnerability. "Elizabeth, let me in." She hesitated but opened it. He entered slowly, as if fearing that any misstep could push her further away. "I heard what you said. That will never belong to that world." He came over, stood before her, and added firmly, "This world needs you, someone who reminds everyone of what really matters. You brought my son back. He brought life to this house, and it brought hope to me." The words touched deeply, but Elizabeth did not immediately respond. She was torn between the heart that was already beating for him and the mind that remembered the social distance that separated them. It was the cruel dilemma, to fight for the love that arose, or to preserve the pride and dignity that had always sustained her. The silence between them was interrupted only by the wind that made the curtains sway. And at the bottom of that silence, a doubt was born that could change everything. How far would Elizabeth be willing to go to accept that perhaps love was also for her? Sunday dawned light, with clear blue skies and gentle wind, as if New York wanted to give a breather to the Whitmores' lives. Daniel had planned something simple but loaded with meaning, to take Elizabeth and Andrew to a picnic in Prospect Park, in the heart of Brooklyn. No waiters, no crystal glasses, just a towel spread out on the grass, a basket of fruit, sandwiches and cookies that Elizabeth had prepared herself. Andrew ran among the trees, laughing with each step, looking more like a child, more free from the weight that silence had imposed on him for so long. Elizabeth watched him tenderly, sitting in the shade, the sun drawing golden reflections in his dark hair. Daniel, who was watching her from afar, realized that this moment was more precious than any deal closed on Park Avenue. As the sunset began to tint the horizon with orange hues, Daniel approached slowly. His heart was beating fast, but his decision was firm. He sat down beside her, held her hand carefully, and the next moment knelt on the grass. Elizabeth, surprised, widened her eyes. "Daniel, what are you doing?" He took a deep breath, looked at her sincerely and said, "Stay with us, like family, like my wife." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Elizabeth put her hand to her face, tears flowing without her being able to contain them. The scene seemed impossible to someone who had grown up invisible, accustomed to sweeping corridors and being ignored in luxury salons. "But I don't have formal clothes, nor an elite last name. I don't belong in that world," she murmured, still hesitantly. Daniel held her chin softly, forcing her to stare into his teary eyes. "Elizabeth, you have something that no one in this world has. Courage. Courage to listen to my son when everyone gave up. Courage to face looks that tried to diminish you. Courage to love without asking for anything in return. And that's exactly what I want by my side." The words fell like a balm on her wounds, and in that instant all fear lost space to the truth that pulsated in her heart. Elizabeth nodded between sobs and said in a thin voice, "Yes, I do." Andrew, who was running across the field, noticed the scene, turned back and threw himself into their arms, laughing, "Family." The embrace of the three was long, tight, illuminated by the sunset that seemed to celebrate together. Later, already at home, Daniel gathered the family. Some were surprised, others shocked, but upon hearing the clear and firm announcement, "I will marry Elizabeth," the room was divided between murmurs and applause. Andrew, without waiting for a reaction, rushed forward and shouted, "She's my mum now!" The uncomfortable silence of some relatives was broken by the boy's innocent conviction. Donna Rosa, a distant aunt, was the first to applaud, followed by some younger members who saw Daniel's gesture as an act of courage. The most conservative looked at each other, but in the face of the unshakable decision, they could do nothing but respect. Elizabeth, standing beside him, felt the ground shake beneath her feet, but not with fear. It was the weight of crossing a border she had never imagined possible. Still with tears in her eyes, she shook Daniel's hand and let the silent promise be made there, in front of everyone. But in her heart, along with hope, there was also a shadow, because every happiness that is too great carries the suspicion that the world, with its harshness, could still try to destroy what had just been born. And the question that hung like a biting wind that night was, who would have the strength to prevent this union from flourishing to the end? The garden of the Whitmore mansion looked different that morning. The flowers were carefully cared for, white chairs lined up in perfect rows, and an ivy arch decorated with delicate lights awaited the bride and groom. There were no exaggerations. There was no unnecessary luxury. It was simple, but loaded with truth, just as Elizabeth wished. Dressed in a simple suit with light fabric and elegant fit, she walked down the improvised corridor with shy but firm steps. Her eyes, teary, reflected the incredulity of someone who never dreamed that one day she would be looked at that way, as the protagonist of a love story. Andrew, small and serious, walked in with the rings in hand, wearing a suit that seemed too big for his body, but perfect for the occasion. He walked proudly, as if carrying not only rings, but the symbol of the family that was finally complete. When it came time for the vows, Daniel spoke in a choked voice, each word weighing like an intimate confession before everyone. "Elizabeth, you saved my son, but you also saved the man I had lost in me. It brought back laughter to my home, hope to my heart. Today, I choose you, not just as a wife, but as a beacon of this new life." Elizabeth could scarcely answer through tears, but in a trembling voice she said, "I never thought I would have a place in this world, but you and Andrew have shown me that family is not just blood or surname, it's choice. And today, I choose you." The silence that followed was broken by the emotional applause of those present, and Andrew, not holding back, shouted, "We're family now!" The ceremony was brief, but unforgettable. There weren't enough crystal goblets to record the intensity of that moment. The kiss sealed not only a marriage, but the overcoming of all social barriers, prejudice, pain, accumulated in years of invisibility. The cleaning workers, who were discreetly watching in the background, cried as if it was their victory too. For the first time, someone who shared their stories, their silent struggles, was there at the altar of a wealthy family, not as a servant, but as an essential part of their lives. In the following months, the transformation did not stop. Elizabeth, encouraged by Daniel, began studying nursing at a community college, determined to formalize the vocation of care that she had always carried in her heart. "I don't just want to be here. I want to have a diploma. I want to be recognized," she said. Daniel, inspired by her strength, created a foundation dedicated to immigrant single mothers, offering scholarships, psychological support, and employment opportunities. The man who had once measured his worth in figures now found purpose in lifting up other women like Elizabeth. The house, once marked by cold corridors and silent walls, has become a symbol of a new life. Photographs of simple moments filled the walls. Andrew learning to ride a bike, Elizabeth studying with open books in the kitchen, family picnic afternoons. The air smelled of homemade food. Laughter echoed down the stairs, and even the employees said they could feel the difference. "This house breathes," they commented. Over time, Elizabeth gained another title, not imposed by society, but by the affection of those around her. The cleaning women, who had previously seen her as a colleague, now called her Mrs. Elizabeth. But she always replied with a smile, "Only Elizabeth is fine. I continue to be who I have always been." And this phrase spread like a lesson. The power was not in leaving behind who you were, but in showing that dignity does not depend on status. The transformation was visible not only in the Whitmore family, but in everyone around them. Those who laughed, who doubted, now observed in silence the strength of that union. Because there was something undeniable. Elizabeth had won, not because of the luxury that now surrounded her, but because she never let the world steal her courage. However, like any story that challenges structures and awakens eyes, there was still a question in the air, unsettling and inevitable. Would this conquered peace withstand the last test that fate still had in store for them? A year passed, and the Whitmore mansion no longer resembled that place of cold marble and heavy silences. Now the sound that filled every corner was Andrew's laughter, running down the hall as he helped entertain little Joshua, the newborn son Elizabeth cradled sweetly in her arms. Daniel watched them from the balcony, his heart watering, as if witnessing a daily miracle. The memories of the past still existed, the looks of contempt, the pain of loss, the hidden tears, but now they came only as memories of a battle won. In the living room, Elizabeth hung a simple painting painted by Andrew with crooked and colorful letters. "A family cannot be bought. It is built." It was the portrait of all that they had achieved, because in the end she was just a cleaning lady. But it was precisely by listening to the silence of a child that he taught all of us what true love is. And perhaps the biggest lesson of this journey is this: no matter where we come from, when we have courage and dignity, we can change entire destinies. If you have followed this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your presence. Your like is like a hug that warms and supports this channel, and your subscription is like an invitation to come back for the next coffee that we will share together. Tell me in the comments which city you are watching, because I want to know how far this story has come. And it activates the bell so you don't lose it when the coffee is ironed again. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, each story carries a strength. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.